Well, hello, friends, and welcome to Thursdays Through the Bible. This is Pastor Keith. Thank you for joining with me as we continue our study of God's Word together. Today, we continue our study of the New Testament, and we come to the first of the epistles, or the letters, and in particular, the start of the letters of the Apostle Paul. Namely, today we come to the letter to the Romans. Romans is a unique book for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that Paul in this letter is writing to a church that he did not plant. Most of Paul's letters, if you read the rest of them, he is writing to churches that he helped establish. And he really was the church planter who founded those churches. And usually when he writes the letters, he's writing as a follow-up. So if you read the book of Acts, you see how Paul bounces around the Eastern Mediterranean world planting churches, but he sort of moves on after a year or two with most of them. And most of Paul's letters are written to follow up with those churches and correct either certain false teachings or certain bad habits that they've come under. But most of the letters of Paul are written from the perspective of the one who planted those churches. Well, Romans is a little interesting, and part of the reason it is so different from Paul's other letters is that exact fact, that Paul did not plant this church. In fact, when he writes the book, it is very likely that neither Paul nor Peter have even visited the church in Rome. Although the Roman church will become affiliated with Peter and Paul, because according to tradition, both those men will be martyred in the city of Rome. Although that will come to pass eventually, when the letter to the Romans is written, no apostle seems to have visited them yet. They are a church that was founded by Christians who basically came from elsewhere in the world. You can imagine Rome being the center capital of the empire. It attracted a lot of visitation. So people would come from around the Roman world, and many of them, no doubt, became Christians elsewhere and then came to Rome and heard about and proclaimed the message of Jesus. So part of the reason that Romans is so different is because Paul is writing to a church that he doesn't really have any personal connection with, but he wants to have a connection with them because he is getting ready to embark on what he hopes will be the next leg of his missionary career. So Paul, by this point, has evangelized, at least in his mind, the Eastern Mediterranean. And he has been in Greece. He's been in all the different provinces that we call Turkey today. He's been around the Eastern Mediterranean. He's done his laps over there, and he's ready to move on to the West. In fact, in chapter 15 of Romans, Paul talks about how his ultimate next step, he wants to go to Spain. He wants to go to the Iberian Peninsula and preach the gospel there and establish churches in the western part of the Roman Empire as well. And on the way there, Paul intends to visit the Romans and raise support from them. And so you really want to think about the letter to the Romans is written by Paul as really a missionary support letter. He's writing to them preemptively, looking for them to support him on his way as he goes to minister to Spain and preach the gospel in the West. And he's writing the book of Romans as a defense and an explanation of the gospel that he preaches. So he wants to write to the Roman church and basically tell them, this is my message. This is the gospel that I preach. It is the apostolic gospel. It is the true faith. And you ought to support me in my endeavors in the proclamation of this gospel to the rest of the Roman world. So it's longer than Paul's other letters. It's much more systemic, right? It's almost like a systematic theology. If you read through the book of Romans, Paul is really addressing all the big topics you would think of when you think of explaining the Christian faith. So, right, the first chapter, Paul talks about his whole point is just to boast in the gospel, right? The gospel of God. And he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. And really, the righteousness of God is a key term for figuring out the rest of the book of Romans. Paul believes that the gospel is not only the power of God, but that in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. So the first 3 chapters, Paul's going to talk about the unrighteousness of sinful men. And then end of chapter 3 through chapter 5, Paul's going to talk about how we receive God's righteousness through faith alone, how we are justified by faith alone. Chapters 6 through 8 are really sort of the outworkings of justification in our lives. You might call it sanctification, about what does it look like then for me in my life as the righteousness of God works itself out in me through God's grace. Chapters 6 through 8 are really all about that. And then God fulfilling his promises in his righteousness to not only Gentiles, but Jews as well, Romans 9 through 11. And then there's a slight transition in chapter 12 where Paul is going to get much more practical, and he's going to talk a little bit less about the gospel itself and the teachings of the gospel, and he's going to get more into the practical ways that the Roman Christians need to live out that gospel in their lives. And that's really the rest of the book from chapters 12 through 15. And then like halfway through chapter 15 and chapter 16 are kind of Paul's sharing with the Romans of his plans, what he's going to do, and just giving them the greetings from the other churches as well. So the letter to the Romans is very significant. I would go so far as to say that in the history of the New Covenant in the last 2,000 years, I would say that there has not been a single book of the Bible that has probably done more and been used more by God than the letter to the Romans. This is the letter that really brought St. Augustine around, one of the probably the pillar of the Western Christian church. This is the letter that sparked Martin Luther and his wrestling with justification and the righteousness of God. It led to the Protestant Reformation. Guys like John Wesley were largely converted to the gospel of grace by this letter, being brought out of that sense of legalism and obedience unto salvation, and instead coming to realize that we're justified by God's grace received through faith alone. I don't think you can really overstate the spiritual significance and the historical importance of the letter to the Romans. In a very real sense, we would not have the modern Western world that we have today if not for how God used this letter in the history of the church. It's a very significant letter, well worth reading and rereading. In fact, one of the church fathers, John Chrysostom, who was probably one of the most gifted preachers in the history of the church, he had a practice of every week he would have somebody read him the letter to the Romans. So every week he's hearing Romans again because it's so significant, it's so important. That might be a worthwhile practice for you, Christian. At least maybe once a month, read through the book of Romans and see if God won't use it to change your life too. Thanks for joining with me for this study. Next week, we will continue studying the letters of Paul. Until then, may God richly bless each one of you.